So, picking up from our last discussion on Anaximander and the anti-physicists, we naturally arrive at the heart of Sextus' method, the modes. These aren't just abstract ideas. They're supposed to be practical tools, standardized arguments designed to get you stuck in that state of suspension of judgment, hypoxia. And where do we find the most detailed look at these tools? Almost exclusively in Sextus' Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Book 1. He lays out different versions, the famous 10 modes, often linked to Anaximander, the more recent 5 modes, and even compressed or specialized versions like the 8 modes targeting causal explanations. While Diogenes Laertius mentions them too, if you want to understand how these modes actually worked as live philosophical devices in the hands of a practicing skeptic, you have to go straight to Sextus. He's our main source for the nitty-gritty. Now when we dig into Sextus' account, some patterns emerge. Those 8 modes aimed at causal explanations. Sextus gives them a very brief, almost dismissive treatment. He outlines their general direction, but doesn't flesh them out. Then, almost immediately, he pivots back to explaining how the 5 modes can be used against causality. It feels like he mentions the 8 just to tick a box, maybe feeling obligated to acknowledge Anaximander' work, but quickly moves on because they don't quite fit his preferred toolkit. The 2 modes? They're basically just shorthand for the 5. So, what's left standing as the real contenders for our attention? Primarily, the 10 modes and the 5 modes, as Sextus presents them. No surprise, then, that a lot of recent scholarship has focused precisely on these 2 sets. Our job here is twofold. First, to unpack what Sextus officially says about them. And second, and perhaps more interestingly, to look at how he actually uses these modes throughout his entire body of work, not just in Book 1. To understand why Sextus might use the modes differently in different places, we need to remember the 2 sides of his skepticism, as he describes it. There's the general account in Book 1, where he defines skepticism as an ability, a skill you cultivate to achieve suspension of judgment and thereby tranquility. Think of it like a mental workout routine. But then there's the specific side, covered in all his other books. Here, he takes this ability and applies it to scrutinize the theories of everyone else, the logicians, physicists, ethicists, aiming to induce suspension of judgment on the topics those thinkers claim to have solved. Now we know he frequently pulls out the 5 modes in these specific critiques, but the 10 modes, much rarer. So the big question becomes, when exactly are these modes particularly useful to him in his practical work? What's their role in the day-to-day skeptical practice? Let's revisit this idea of skepticism as an ability. This is crucial. For Sextus, skepticism isn't primarily about constructing arguments to prove you should suspend judgment. Instead, it's about cultivating a certain psychological state. You gather up all the conflicting arguments and impressions about a topic. They feel equally strong, equally persuasive, isostheneia. Because there's no clear winner, no way to choose, you naturally end up suspending judgment. Hypoxia happens. It's less like winning a logical debate and more like being equally attracted to 2 equally delicious desserts and just giving up trying to pick one. Importantly, this view avoids the trap of arguing for suspension. If you argue for suspension, you need reasons, norms of rationality. But wait, Sextus suspends judgment on all theoretical matters, including logic and induction. He wouldn't sign up for any such norms himself. So, the goal isn't to argue for suspension, but to create the conditions where suspension naturally arises as a psychological effect. Okay, so how does this play out with the 10 modes? The standard interpretation, often called the orthodox reconstruction, runs into trouble here. According to this view, the 10 modes do argue for the conclusion that we ought to suspend judgment. Look at the structure. First, they lay out all these conflicting appearances. Things look different to different animals, different people, under different conditions. Second, they state that we can't pick one appearance as better than another. Third, and here's the kicker, they conclude that therefore we must suspend judgment about the true nature of things. See the problem? This sounds exactly like the kind of argument for suspension that Sextus, as an ability-based skeptic, is trying to avoid. It looks like it's endorsing a norm. Because appearances conflict, you must suspend. That's a judgment, not just a psychological effect. So this orthodox reading clashes head-on with Sextus' own description of skepticism as an ability. Remember, for him, epoche is the result, the psychological outcome of facing equal-strength arguments, not the conclusion reached by reasoning. Arguing for suspension based on conflicting appearances feels like stepping outside the skeptical camp entirely. It's like saying, here's why you should give up trying to know things. But Sextus suspends judgment on all theoretical conclusions, including how to reason correctly. Plus, look at the text itself. Sextus consistently says that suspension comes directly from contemplating the opposing appearances within each mode. He never frames it as, now let's take these opposing appearances and pit them against the dogmatist's arguments to force suspension. Furthermore, many of the concluding remarks in the 10 modes use language like it is necessary to suspend judgment, or we are compelled to suspend judgment. This sounds less like a psychological effect and more like a rational necessity being argued for. Let's look at some of those textual clues more closely. In Mode 1, talking about different animals perceiving things differently, Sextus says, if the appearances turn out different, it is necessary to suspend judgment. Later in the same mode, discussing trustworthiness, he says, I will be compelled to suspend judgment. In Mode 2 about human differences, he states, it is necessary, then, that suspension of judgment is introduced because of the difference among humans. Similar language pops up in Mode 6, 8, and 10. Again and again, it's this idea that given the inability to decide between conflicting appearances, suspension becomes something we are compelled or necessary to do. This strongly suggests that Sextus, at least in his presentation of the 10 modes, is framing them as arguments leading to a rational conclusion. Suspension is the required response. So, we're left with a puzzle. The 10 modes, as Sextus presents them, seem to argue for conclusions like, we must suspend judgment, which seems to contradict his broader picture of skepticism as an ability producing a psychological effect, not a rational verdict. Why this inconsistency? One possibility is that the 10 modes are historical baggage. They come from Anisidormus, an earlier figure in the Pyrrhonian tradition. Maybe they were designed for a slightly different purpose, perhaps emphasizing the idea that we can never grasp the pure, unadulterated nature of things, because everything is always perceived in relation to something else, a theme of relativity that seems less central to Sextus's later, more focused approach. Another angle is that Sextus himself might have felt a bit awkward with them. He includes them, acknowledges their existence, but then largely sets them aside, much like he did with the 8 modes on causality. Perhaps he saw their potential, but found them clunky or ill-suited for the kind of detailed, ongoing inquiry he preferred. Now let's shift gears to the 5 modes. These feel quite different. Firstly, they're much more general. Instead of specific perceptual quirks like honey tasting sweet or bitter depending on the animal, they deal with fundamental structures of argument and justification. This makes them far more relevant to Sextus' typical focus, which is on the principles archae of various fields, the existence of criteria of truth, the nature of demonstration, the concept of place, and so on. Secondly, the 5 modes are systematically connected. They form a sequence designed to dismantle any attempt to establish a positive thesis. It goes like this: start with a dispute with no resolution. If someone tries to justify their position, you hit them with infinite regress. If they insist on a foundation, bring in relativity. If they just throw out an unsupported claim, use hypothesis. And if they try to make 2 claims support each other, reciprocal mode shuts that down too. It's a systematic dismantling kit for arguments. The beauty of this 5-mode system lies in its logical flow. Imagine a dogmatist confidently asserts their theory. The skeptic counters, okay, prove it. What's your basis? That leads to the infinite regress challenge. The dogmatist might retort, some claims are self-evident, they don't need support. The skeptic fires back with the relativity mode. Nothing supports itself, everything is relative to something else. The dogmatist might say, fine, just accept this foundational claim. The hypothesis mode strikes. Why that one? It's arbitrary. Just as arbitrary as its opposite. Finally, the dogmatist might try circularity. P because Q because P. The reciprocal mode exposes this as empty. At this point, the skeptic argues, you've exhausted all options. Any attempt to build a secure case hits one of these walls. It's a powerful, systematic challenge to any project aiming for definitive knowledge. So, how should we interpret the 5 modes? Like the 10, they are inherently oppositional. They are responses to dogmatic claims. But unlike the 10, the language of necessity or compulsion is less dominant. When Sextus first introduces them in their canonical order, he often uses simpler language. We end up at suspension follows, we suspend judgment. This phrasing aligns better with the idea that the 5 modes are tools to generate suspension as an outcome of the skeptical ability, rather than arguments forcing us to rationally commit to suspension. It fits more comfortably with Sextus' overall picture of skepticism as an ongoing process of generating undecidability, rather than settling on a negative conclusion. Recent scholarship has explored ways to read the five modes as constantly preventing settlement, rather than achieving it, which resonates well with this initial presentation. Despite their systematic potential, Sextus rarely uses all five modes together in his later works. He mentions them as a set, but application is mostly piecemeal. Why? One reason seems to be a genuine confusion about the relativity mode. When he applies the five modes later, he often separates it out, placing it last and discussing it almost in isolation, disconnected from the logical chain of the other four. It feels like he doesn't quite grasp how it integrates into the systematic dismantling of justification. Another reason might be strategic. Using the full five modes system could feel like delivering a knockout blow, shutting down discussion permanently. But Sextus wants to keep the inquiry going, topic by topic, forever. It might feel too much like the negative dogmatism he criticizes elsewhere, the position that says, you can never know anything. Instead, he prefers to use individual modes selectively, making limited points at specific moments in his arguments, keeping the conversation open-ended. Jonathan Barnes famously criticized this piecemeal approach. His argument was, if the five modes already give you universal suspension, why bother with all the detailed arguments about physics or ethics in books 2 and 3? Isn't that just wasting ink? But this misunderstands Sextus. First, as we've discussed, Sextus isn't aiming for the conclusion, you must suspend judgment everywhere, as that would be inconsistent with his method. Even if we interpret the modes as generating suspension, he doesn't want a permanent, final state of suspension achieved once and for all. Skepticism for Sextus is an ongoing activity, a continuous exercise of the skeptical ability applied repeatedly to different topics. It's about maintaining perpetual epiche and ataraxia, not reaching a destination of settled ignorance. The global potential of the five modes is acknowledged, but largely ignored in practice in favor of this continuous topic-by-topic engagement. So where does Sextus actually deploy these individual five modes in his writings? The data shows a clear pattern. Their use is overwhelmingly concentrated in contexts we'd classify as epistemological, discussions about criteria of truth, signs, demonstration, the nature of knowledge, how we justify beliefs. This makes perfect sense, as these are the areas where questions of justification and the possibility of establishing truth are front and center. Outside of these core epistemological sections, their use drops dramatically. For instance, in Against the Logicians, where the focus is heavily on epistemology, I've found 21 instances. In the corresponding section of Book 2 of the Outlines, also epistemological 14 instances. But in the rest of Book 2, dealing with more logical minutiae, and in Against the Physicists or Ethicists, the numbers plummet. It's clear they're most useful when the subject is the justification of claims themselves. Two subtler patterns emerge when comparing the outlines to the other works. First, the frequency of using five modes material is higher in the outlines, page for page, especially in the epistemological sections. Second, the outlines shows a greater tendency to combine multiple modes at once. Why the difference? I think it connects to the very nature of the outlines as an outline. The five modes are efficient tools for shutting down arguments quickly. Using them, especially in combination, allows Sextus to gesture at complex reasoning without spelling it all out, saving space and time. It's like using abbreviations. Since the outlines aims to be concise, it makes sense that it would lean more heavily on these shorthand arguments, compared to his more discursive, detailed attachments in the other works, where he might spell out the reasoning more fully. So, what's the takeaway from all this? From one perspective, it's a bit disappointing. The modes, especially the 10, sound impressive in Book 1, but in Sextus' actual practice across his works, they seem less central than initially advertised. The 8 modes are almost an afterthought. The 10 modes, while historically significant, feel ill-suited to his main goals and are largely set aside. The 5 modes, though clearly more useful, are also not used in their full systematic power. Instead, they're deployed piecemeal. This suggests Sextus is near the end of a long Pyrrhonian tradition. He carries historical baggage, respects figures like Anaximander, but finds much of the older toolkit less effective for his own refined skeptical practice. It reminds us that what Sextus says he's doing and what he actually does might not always align perfectly, not necessarily due to error, but because he's navigating a complex historical legacy.